Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. It's a big show, there is a lot around. Revelations from the head of our spy agency that a former MP betrayed Australia to foreign spies. Well, that might have made the headlines, but what's equally as concerning is this warning about the rise of Islamist terror threats here in Australia. Rather than getting caught up in a Canberra guessing game, this should be our focus. More bad news for Chris Bowen as Toyota becomes the latest car manufacturer to rebuke his emissions scheme. This is shaping up to be a real issue for Labor and another example of ideology trumping reality for Chris Bowen. Plus, what is the Human Rights Commission afraid of? It's got a one-sided transgender inquiry coming up, and it's been blasted as being a waste of time as women, that's right, women, are deemed unqualified to make submissions. Senator Claire Chandler didn't hold back on this in the Senate, and she'll join me later. And yet again today, Immigration Minister Andrew Giles faced demands he resign over the botched handling of the foreign criminals issue.
149 hardcore criminals have been released into the community. The Minister has not taken a single application to re-detain one of these criminals. When will you show leadership, stop being so weak and sack this Minister?
We are not in a position to defy an order of the High Court.
Order. Order. Members on my left.
And no one is suggesting that they should do that.
But first, the revelation by Australia's top spy chief that a former politician tried to recruit a family member of a Prime Minister to spy for a foreign power. Well, naturally enough, that sparked the mother of all guessing games. In his annual public speech outlining Australia's latest threat levels, ASIO boss Mike Burgess said this.
Several years ago, the A-Team successfully cultivated and recruited a former Australian politician. This politician sold out their country, party, former colleagues to advance the interests of a foreign regime.
And our spy chief, well, he went on.
At one point, the former politician even proposed bringing a Prime Minister's family member into the spy's orbit. Fortunately, that plot did not go ahead, but others did.
Every politician and former politician who faced the media today was asked to speculate on the identity of the alleged traitor. Some, like Joe Hockey and Peter Dutton, said that if the ex-politician isn't named, then all of them are effectively tarred with the same brush.
You cannot have the head of our national security organisation go public with allegations against or statements of fact against a politician and then not have the guts to name who that person was. A rap on the knuckles from the head of ASIO is not appropriate, and it's not enough for someone who was a traitor to Australia.
I think it is unfair on a lot of former MPs who are patriotic, as 99.9% on both sides are, and if there's one that they've identified who's not, then frankly that person should be outed and shamed.
Others, like Senator James Patterson, he joins me a little later, he made the obvious point, though, that the incident likely relates to a time before 2018 when Australia did not have legislation to even deal with the matter of foreign interference. So what this individual did in selling out their country was, according to the ASIO boss, wrong, but back then almost impossible to prosecute.
As is explained, the conduct occurred before the passage of the espionage and foreign interference legislation in 2018, which means they couldn't be charged for offences because it was not retrospective. Given that, I think it would be unfair to name someone publicly, and you'd obviously be running a very serious defamation risk if you did so.
Now, I use that date of 2018 as a bit of a guide, meaning that the incident occurred before the legislation was put in place. Then I reckon I've got a good handle on who we're talking about here. A former New South Wales Labor politician. Now, Malcolm Turnbull's son Alex this afternoon speculated that he might have been involved here in that Burgess talked about a family member of a Prime Minister being approached, and as he said to the journalist Samantha Maiden, it was just so brazen. This is Alex Turnbull, just so brazen. My reaction was to express no interest, This was all about an equity deal, we're told, in a company connected to the activist, and that Turnbull then forwarded the details immediately to authorities. As Maiden reports, in this case, Alex Turnbull said he was told that the group that approached him had links to a former New South Wales Labor state MP. But rather than play Canberra parlour games and speculate further on events that are now 5+ years or more in the past, I'm more concerned about the other big statements in the Burgess speech that seem to have got lost in the media guessing game today about this unnamed politician. Because what worried me most out of the ASIO threat assessment last night were the comments from the ASIO boss about the realistic threat of terror attacks here in Australia.
Since the October 7 atrocities by Hamas, the conflict has expanded with attacks carried out by a range of terrorists, particularly those aligned with Iran. We have seen attempts by ISIL and Al-Qaeda to use the conflict to motivate attacks globally. Sunni violent extremism poses the greatest religiously motivated extremist threat in Australia. ASIO remains concerned, though, about lone actors, the potential for an individual or small group under the radar of authorities to use readily available weapons to carry out an act of terrorism.
And so my focus today has been on what the Prime Minister is or is not doing to reassure the community that he's across this risk and that our intelligence agencies and police have whatever resources they need to keep us safe. As Burgess said, the risk of Islamist terror is real. Now, he's the expert. He's our top intelligence head in Australia. And this is why I have repeatedly raised concerns about the government's decision to rapidly grant over 2,000 visas to people out of Gaza with little or no capacity to vet the security risk of any individual. And if we can't thoroughly vet them, if we are not thoroughly vetting them, then we have to ask ourselves why are we even bringing people from Gaza at all, given that the most reliable polling suggests that almost half of Gazan residents back Hamas, and about 3/4 of them thought the barbarism of October 7 was justified. But it's not just who we're allowing in via this online visa process, it's what we are tolerating here on the streets of our cities and in many of our mosques. Almost every weekend now in Sydney and Melbourne, we have these pro-Hamas protests that are escalating in their jihadi language. Part of the problem is the conflation of anti-Semitism that's now rampant and visible on our streets with Islamophobia, which is far less prevalent. The ASIO boss was himself an exemplar of this bogus moral equivalence when he said in his speech, and I quote, "Hateful rhetoric has targeted Israel and the Jewish community, as well as," he says, "Muslim and Palestinian communities." I mean, show me a single protest in Australia that's called for the expulsion of all Palestinians from Gaza and all Palestinians from the West Bank, because there isn't one. And yet the bile from these hate preachers in our mosques goes on and on, unprosecuted and even unchallenged.
Jihad is part of our deen and one of the highest pillars of our deen. Hamas is mujahideen and freedom fighters and warriors.
A day when the stones and the trees will speak and say, "Oh Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." The trees will speak, the stone will speak, and they'll say, "Oh Muslim, oh believer, there is a Yahudi behind me, come and kill him."
This has to be a spark for the Ummah, and a spark to the final solution. To unite the Muslim world under one leader, the Khalifa, the Imam, the Sultan.
Now, beyond all of that, the latest example this week was put to air on ABC Radio yesterday, with the Islamic Council of Victoria President Adil Salman failing to condemn the October 7 atrocities. Indeed, he said of the rising up on October 7, quote, "That's legitimate."
It is absolutely legitimate for the Palestinians to try to break the siege of Gaza.
No, I'm talking about October the 7th.
As I said, I'm not going to condemn the Palestinians for resisting. I'm not going to condemn the Palestinians for trying to break their siege on their territory.
It's fair enough for the ASIO director to warn of the possibility of terror attacks, and I hope to God the Prime Minister and his front bench aren't asleep at the wheel here, as they have been on the issue of these foreign criminals. But what about taking some action against all those here now that are creating a climate conducive to terrorism? Are we arresting and charging those hate preachers as we should? Are we cancelling any of the visas of the non-citizens and deporting them as we should? Are we denying visas to radical imams as we should? Are we removing their hate-filled speeches from the internet as we should? Now, we know that our police are more than capable of breaking up demonstrations. When I lived through that in Victoria during the pandemic. So I want to get some assurances from the Prime Minister and his authorities that now they've had this threat assessment from the ASIO chief, that they will actually do something about it. Not have an inquiry, not give us all this empty Labor rhetoric, but actually do something to give us all comfort that everything can be and is being done to keep Australians safe. Now, tonight I'm far more concerned about the risk of Islamist terrorism than the guessing game about a former politician who did the wrong thing around espionage. I don't condone it. I would much prefer to be able to tell you who I think it is or have the actual name out there tonight. But to me, the real risk, the real headline is our terror risk. All right, let's go to camera now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
We begin with breaking news. Victoria Police have dropped charges against a freed immigration detainee. The statement came just hours after police and Border Force had confirmed the 44-year-old man had been arrested and charged with a number of sexual assault offences. The ex-detainee has been cleared after police returned to the Richmond address and identified another man on CCTV who they now believe was involved. Shockwaves here in Canberra as ASIO reveals a former politician was successfully recruited by foreign spies.
This politician sold out their country, party, former colleagues to advance the interests of a foreign regime.
A rap on the knuckles from the head of ASIO is not appropriate, and it's not enough for someone who was a traitor to Australia.
And the President of the Philippines has declared his country won't back down in its territorial dispute with China.
I will not allow any attempt by any foreign power to take even 1 square inch of our sovereign territory.
Australia and the Philippines signed a new strategic partnership last year and have conducted joint drills in the South China Sea.
We are both island nations. We are both trading nations. And for both of us, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is not an abstract notion or a theoretical question.
Speculation is mounting. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been invited to Australia next month. No confirmation, though, from Foreign Minister Wang as to whether those dates have been locked in. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, joining me to discuss the day's other stories and a whole lot of other headlines too. The Australian Sophie Ellsworth, media writer there, of course, and the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Well, first to Victoria, if I can with you, Sophie. It was reported earlier today that one of those 149 foreign criminals, released, of course, last year by the Albanese government, had been arrested and charged with new sex offences. That's now been ruled out by Victoria Police. Those charges have been withdrawn from that individual in question. Now, we don't know the ins and outs of that actual sexual assault, what's going to happen there. If they've got somebody else in mind, that's not clear. But I tell you, it's a shocking week for the government in the parliament, that particular issue aside, because the feature of question time, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and again today, has been Andrew Giles at the dispatch box, unable to make heads or tails of most of the questions, and of course put under pressure by the coalition because they had the laws go through the parliament in December to make urgent application to the courts to lock some of these detainees up again, but not one application has yet been made by the government.
Well, Peter, you've been talking about this for months since this giant mess has unfolded, and it really shows that the minister is not up to the job. And to be honest, Peter, I'm surprised he's still got this portfolio because it's been a complete and utter shambles. Particularly from last year when more than 100 detainees were released into the public, and very concerning for Australians. This is not a good look for the government, and also, Peter, I might add, very bad look for the Victoria Police as well. We don't know all the details, but it appears from the reading I've done this afternoon that there's a case of mistaken identity. So a bad look for the police force and a bad look for the government.
I will add the man that they thought was involved in these rape allegations, as I said, charges have been withdrawn. I'm not going to use his name. But that individual in Australia, one of the free detainees, was convicted of rape in Queensland, got a visa after that rape conviction in jail to stay in Australia, came down to Victoria, committed sexual assaults here, was jailed again, locked up in detention. He tonight is out on the streets after that action last year from the government. So that is how serious things are. Islamist terrorism, that warning last night from Mike Burgess is about as serious as it gets, Daniel. And yet almost every weekend, certainly in Melbourne it's every weekend, we've got these pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas sort of demonstrations. We've got all of these hate preachers online. The speeches are there. They can be watched by young people. They go around the world. And of course you can be at Friday prayers and get it in most mosques around Australia. When are we going to get serious about this?
Well, we need to get serious quick, Peter. There's a big problem out there. You've just outlined that. And Australians can no longer have assurance that the government has control over our migration program. We know that over the last year, more than 1 million migrants were brought into Australia. The first time in our nation's history in one single year, we had more than 1 million migrants. Now, I'm sure that the overwhelming majority are here to do the right thing, but we have seen a dramatic breakdown of social cohesion. We've seen the importation of religious and sectarian conflict, which goes against everything that our nation stands for and has fought for over many decades. Australians expect that if you will come into our country, you will allow those to live their religious views out peacefully. That is one of the foundations of our way of life and our values. We've seen with the release of the detainees into the community, the government does not have a handle on many aspects of the migration system. And I think Australians are growing in their concern about who is actually out there in the community, and does the government actually know who is coming into our nation and what values are they bringing here?
Sophie, this one is extraordinary. Not one but two suppression orders were rushed through the courts to keep the identity, religion and ethnicity of a Melbourne-based activist involved in an alleged crime a secret. Now, this is a person who has an association to outspoken author Clementine Ford and known to many politicians, and they were allegedly involved in the abduction and torture of a man in his 30s earlier this month, and one of the two people charged with a number of high-level offences. Now, what's behind this level of secrecy?
Well, Peter, we don't have a lot of detail. That's the big part of the problem here, and the lawyers involved have not provided much information on the reasons behind the suppression order. But again, this is concerning for the public and goes back to the premise, don't they deserve to have a right to know who this person is who has committed these alleged crimes? And this is concerning that there's such a high level of secrecy, which seems to be almost the norm in Victoria, Peter. So I think the more people that find out about this will be concerned that they don't actually know who this alleged criminal is.
I did find this interesting today, Daniel. We had the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in Canberra, and he gave us a bit of a lecture about climate change. Have a listen.
Climate change. My country accepts its part in our collective responsibility. My administration is committed to accelerating our just, affordable, sustainable and inclusive energy transition towards carbon neutrality. The Philippines has the potential to be a net carbon sink, absorbing more carbon dioxide than we emit. Yet we are one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, ranking first in the 2023 World Risk Index.
But if you have a look at the emissions coming out of Philippines, I'll put them on the screen. We've got a little graph there for you. I mean, it's hypocrisy writ large. Their emissions are climbing and climbing and climbing at the same time as emissions have fallen in places like Australia, Canada and the United States.
Well, there's three words, Peter: follow the money. As you know, these climate undertakings are more often than not about getting money into the country, and fair enough, at one level you can understand why he wants to do it, but quite often this has nothing to do with climate, as all the buzzwords were in there. And we know that the Philippines has been vying to host an international fund that would then give out money to developing nations that are apparently dealing with climate-related issues. But we don't need to have developing leaders or leaders of developing nations focused on climate. They have to focus on the rule of law, how to improve the prosperity of their people, get people out of poverty, focusing on those issues that matter to the day-to-day lives of their citizens. And it's just so concerning when you have these leaders that are no doubt looking to get money out of our nation or other international organisations, which is so far removed from the actual concerns on the ground.
Hey, you're spot on. Daniel, Sophie, thank you. Thank you both. All right, let's go to more bad news for the poor old hapless Chris Bowen and his push on electric vehicles. Today, Toyota is the latest automotive company to come out and say that the pace of the government's new vehicle emission standards is simply not feasible. Toyota's warning comes at the same time as new intelligence shows just how fanciful Bowen's ambition is, with only 25% of current vehicles in the market able to meet the standard that's supposed to come into effect at the start of next year. For more on this, I'm joined now by senior motoring journalist Paul Gover. Well, Paul, I tell you what, he's opened up a can of worms with that emission standards a couple of weeks ago now. I mean, we could do a story about this every night because it's not just Toyota. You, as I understand it, we're talking to a whole lot of manufacturers. They are very concerned, aren't they?
Oh, they're hugely concerned. They're hugely concerned about their business, obviously, but what they're really concerned about is the impact on customers. I was talking to a CEO of one brand today who said the first thing that's going to happen with all of this is that people are going to keep their dirty, smelly cars for longer. So Mr. Bowen's actually going to cut the sales of new cars, make them more expensive, and convince people that the best choice for them is to hang on to a car for longer.
What about these standards, though? I mean, if only 25% of cars in the marketplace now can meet the standards and they're due to come in under 12 months' time, realistically, I mean, the government's got to back down here, don't they?
Smart people would back down. And it's not a case of backing down. All the companies I've talked to
Bowen's
agree
not smart, but anyway,
that we need to have... Yeah, I'm with you. A lot of people agree. Everybody agrees we need to do something, but it doesn't need to bang them in the head on day one. What needs to be looked at is the glide path over the next 5 years and set the standard based on we're starting on this day at this level and it comes down from there. What they're doing at the moment is going to enforce penalties on just about every car maker except pure electric brands from the beginning of next year.
I think this next story is telling us something because Apple likes to make money and is always ahead of the curve. What did you make of the news this week that Apple is abandoning its plans on electric cars after 10 years and billions of dollars of development? They're walking away from EVs. What's it tell you?
What it tells me is what I'm reading every day in the global press. Early adopters rush to have electric cars. The people who are fans of Elon Musk and think he's saving the world rush to electric cars. What's happening? It's around the world. It's in America, it's in Europe, it's everywhere. When they take the incentives off, when there are no government incentives, people don't buy these things. But also, car companies are now admitting they're losing money on making electric cars. Ford even split the company in half. They have an internal combustion half, and the job of the internal combustion half is to make the profits so that they can do electric cars because they're losing money on their whole electric business case. And I would say that's the same for most of the car companies around the world right now.
Paul, how likely is it that we'll go away from combustion cars, sure, but we'll end up with another technology. Like, we'll go back to where we were a couple of years ago, really exploring hydro. Could that be where we end up?
Yep. Okay, so two things. We're going to get a lot more hybrids, and the good news for pickup drivers is that next year Ford will have a plug-in hybrid version of the Ranger. But I was in Germany just last month. I talked to a guy who works at Porsche. Now, don't judge me for being at Porsche, but basically he's saying e-fuels. So this is fuel you make in a laboratory using renewable energy, CO2, taking CO2 out of the oxygen, and you make a liquid fuel. And he's saying, and he's got lots of research and they're spending a lot of money, he's saying e-fuels can save the world because unlike electric, you can also develop it to be used in planes and boats as well as transport. And I think of all the things I've heard, there's a lot of talk about using hydrogen either in combustion engines or to have a fuel cell, which is the same thing I have on spacecraft. This, to me, makes the most sense of anything I've heard.
A long way to run, I reckon, Paul. Have a good weekend. Thank you, as always, for your time. Right after the break, more on that warning from the ASIO chief overnight about the threat of Islamist terrorism in Australia. Senator James Paterson coming up. Plus, why is there an inquiry into transgender rights but not one into gender medicine in kids? It makes no sense. And why are women banned too from having their say in this inquiry? Look, in a tick, we'll be joined by Senator Claire Chandler, who has berated the Human Rights Commission for essentially blocking women's voices in their upcoming trans rights inquiry. But first, during his annual threat assessment speech in Canberra last night, ASIO boss Mike Burgess warned of a rising Islamist terror threat in Australia. Now, normally the spy agency keeps its cards close to its chest, but Burgess revealed publicly that they've been on high alert since the outbreak of war in Gaza, which has seen an increase in tensions within the community. Joining me now to discuss this, Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Senator James Paterson. Well, Senator, thank you for your time. Look, I'll get to those sex offence charges late this afternoon against a freed detainee in Victoria. But just on the Burgess address last night, surely this warning highlights the need for a crackdown on all the anti-Semitic sentiment, the hate preachers in the mosques in particular, that we've seen in Australia since October.
Exactly right, Peter. The Islamist terror threat has not gone away. In fact, it remains the principal source of the terror threat that Australia faces, as Mike Burgess said in his speech last night. And frankly, I think sometimes we can get distracted by other important national security threats and fail to remember that the most likely way that an Australian will be killed as a result of a foreign threat is from a terrorist attack here on our own soil. So absolutely clear moral leadership is required here from the government, from the Prime Minister down. And frankly, I don't think we've had that. I think there's been turning of the blind eye and tolerating of poor behaviour, which we should not accept in a liberal democracy like Australia.
If we've got our peak spy agency concerned about Islamist terror threats in Australia, then you've got to bring into question the granting of over 2,000 visas to people coming out of Gaza by another arm of government, surely.
Well, particularly when those visas have been granted in as little as 1 hour in some instances and on average over 24 hours. How can you possibly be sure someone coming from a war zone controlled by a terrorist organisation doesn't have sympathies for that terrorist organisation if you're not doing adequate security and identity checks, which it is impossible to do in 1 hour and difficult to do even in 1 day. These should be very carefully considered. We have no presence there on the ground, and I think we are running a very real risk here.
You know Mike Burgess, I mean, he's not prone to overblown rhetoric. He's pretty sober in his assessments. He warned last night there's a realistic possibility of a terror attack in Australia within the next year. So how confident are you that the government's up to the job here, that it's doing what's necessary to keep Australians safe when you've got ministers like Andrew Giles in these key security portfolios?
Peter, in the national interest, I wish I could answer that question by saying I had a high degree of confidence. But you've seen what I've seen, what the public has seen over the last few months from this government. And whether it is the released detainees, boats reaching our borders, or a whole range of other national security issues, they have been consistently weak, they have been consistently slow, and they've been consistently incompetent. So I don't have faith in them. I do have faith in the good people at ASIO and the Australian Federal Police and their state counterparts who are very diligent, but they need support and they need leadership from the top, and frankly, they're not getting it under this Prime Minister.
Burgess last night also said there was an unnamed former politician that had been recruited by foreign spies. This is all a few years ago, but he said this person had sold out Australia. He's been under pressure today to reveal the name. Late this afternoon, Malcolm Turnbull's son, Alex Turnbull, said he was approached by an activist. We take it as a foreign activist, but by an activist. He reported it to authorities. Well, given he's put his hand up here, does that give ASIO cover now to tell us who this former politician was?
Peter, this is a very important wake-up call for the public and, importantly, the political class, that foreign interference is a persistent and pervasive threat, and that espionage is too, and we shouldn't be naive or complacent about that. So I welcome what the Director-General has said. It's not for me to publicly disclose who this person is, but I think as much detail should be provided as can be provided by the Director-General, and even more importantly by the government. There's nothing to stop a minister walking into the House of Representatives or the Senate with the protection of parliamentary privilege and disclosing what they can and what they know about their circumstances, because someone has gotten away with a very serious crime. Because of the time they committed it before the espionage and foreign interference laws passed, they could not be charged, and they've got away with it in that sense, and that is a shocking thing.
James Patterson, thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
I don't suspect I'm the only one who'd sleep much better at night if we knew that James Patterson was running the show and not Andrew Giles. But let's move now to a really important issue that I know will shock many of you. As discussed in the Senate last night by my next guest, the Australian Human Rights Commission is conducting an inquiry into transgender human rights, but there are already fears that the outcome will be biased. The inquiry plans to focus on anti-trans mobilisation and disinformation. They're two terms I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, but what's really disturbing is it will only accept submissions from experts in trans and gender diverse matters. Joining me now to discuss this, the woman in question who raised it in the Senate, Liberal Senator Claire Chandler. Claire, thank you for your time. I understand we've got experts out there, women's experts, women's rights experts saying this is going to be an inquiry basically about one side of this debate. I think that's my concern, and I think that's also your concern as well.
Well, that's exactly right, Peter. When the Human Rights Commission is saying that they are only going to accept submissions from subject matter experts, and they're concerned about anti-trans sentiments and all of these sorts of things, I think we know that this inquiry is going to be incredibly one-sided. And we also have to remember that the Australian Human Rights Commission has great form in this area. This is the entity that teamed up with Sport Australia 5 years ago to develop a set of inclusion guidelines for sports that said that men should be allowed to compete in women's sports. And I have every expectation that when the AHRC is looking at the so-called experts that it wants to hear from in this inquiry now, they want to hear from those same people who think that men should be in women's sports, that male sex offenders should be in women's prisons. They don't want to listen to the overwhelming majority of Australians who think that this is madness, and they don't want to listen to the many millions of Australian women who this is going to impact on.
What do they mean by that term, Claire? Anti-trans mobilisation. What does it even mean?
I think that's a very good question, Peter, and I certainly will be interested to see if the AHRC provides any context around that through the course of this inquiry. But I've always been concerned about the way that radical left activists classify women who fight for women's sex-based rights as anti-trans or bigoted or transphobic. That is not what this is about. What this is about is ensuring that women and girls can continue to enjoy the rights that we have fought very hard for over generations, the rights to single-sex spaces and single-sex services and single-sex sport. There's nothing radical about that, but like I say, those on the crazy left like to categorise it as radical in an attempt to deplatform these women.
Claire, it feels to me about this whole debate about Islamophobia as if criticising Islamism is somehow criticising Muslims. I see there's a clear distinction between the two. But the cover of Islamophobia is thrown over you and you're not sort of allowed to discuss these things. Of course, we can today because it's very much front and centre for our ASIO chief. And it feels to me that anyone who's arguing for women's rights is now classed as suddenly being anti-trans, when that's not necessarily the case. But it's often that the trans activists are anti-women.
Oh, that's absolutely right, Peter. And being anti-trans, like I say, is just one of the many smears and the many slurs that the radical left make against women who advocate for these issues. And I think those on the left need to remember that it is many women on the left who have fought for these sex-based rights for generations over time. And I know that because these women speak to me and they say, you know, I haven't traditionally been a Liberal voter, Claire, but you're the Liberal senator who is speaking out about these issues.
I have the same thing happen to me. People stop me at the airport, I mean, absolutely hardcore lefties, and say if it wasn't for women on the right like you, Peter Credlin, and of course you too, Claire, raising some of these issues, they feel their voices are silent. How can we, though, have this taxpayer-funded body, the Human Rights Commission, how can we have an inquiry here to one side of the trans debate, but all the parliaments that have tried to have a debate or an inquiry, both sides, into the issue of gender dysphoria and gender medicine for children, and I'm talking there of the federal parliament, the Queensland parliament, the Victorian parliament, they've all been shut down.
Well, I think fundamentally it's because in all of those parliaments that you just reeled off the names of, Peter, the parties of the political left, Labor and the Greens, team up to shut down these inquiries from happening. And I think that is completely cowardly on behalf of those parties. But like I say, Australian women have sadly known for some time that the Labor Party, that the Greens Party are not interested in fighting for their rights.
When do you think Lydia Thorpe's going to grow up?
That's a very interesting question, Peter. I assume you're referring to Senator Thorpe's behaviour in
just that shocking behaviour in the
night. Absolutely. And look, I think it's disappointing to see that sort of behaviour in the Senate at any point in time, but it was particularly disappointing seeing it during the adjournment debate on Tuesday night. Adjournment debate is a time when we as senators take the issues that our constituents are raising with us into the chamber. It's a very wide-ranging debate and it's an opportunity for us to talk about those issues that are facing Australians and facing Tasmanians in my own case. And to see that sort of behaviour from another senator that resulted in that debate, I should say, being shut down, it's incredibly disappointing.
I agree with you there. Claire, thank you as always. Keep up the fight. All right, after the break, we'll take a closer look at Dunkley. It's going to go down to the wire. We'll be here, of course, on Saturday night in just a moment. Well, I need 2 sleeps now till Dunkley on Saturday. My colleague Tom Connell has some new analysis.
Dunkley is a seat in Melbourne's outer southeast, taking in the iconic Port Phillip Bay. It's been held by Labor since 2019. Before that, it was Liberal, though, for nearly 2 decades. And it's a seat that on paper suits this coalition strategy of outer suburban seats from Labor. Also, it hopes taking seats back in Melbourne. It's down to just 2 in Melbourne after the Aston by-election. So despite a 6.3% margin, it is hotly contested. The demographics could be positive for the coalition. More tradies than the average around Australia, more mortgage holders feeling the cost of living pinch with a slightly lower household income. And these stats are from 2021. It's got worse since then. On Labor's side, 87% will get a bigger tax cut under their income tax cut changes. And of those renting, plenty are feeling the pinch. Dunkley also has a very high percentage of people born in Australia. Labor has the numbers on its side when it comes to those tax cut changes. Remember, its plan is better for anyone earning less than $146,000 in Dunkley. 2.8% of workers earn more than $182,000. That's about half the national average. 4.5% earn more than $152,000 and 13% more than 104,000. If the coalition gets a small swing, it starts to eye these similar seats at the next federal election around the country. A bigger swing, they get more ambitious. New South Wales in particular, in this circumstance, becomes a major hunting ground. So what about swing expectations? Recent by-elections, they've been mixed. Some swings to and some swings against government. Always different factors in by-election. One of the ones here, we've got the death of a sitting member in Canning. The last time that happened, there was a savage swing against the Liberal Party, the government then, but the party had just opposed the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. Looking at the trends since 2009, the average is only a 0.7 swing against the government. Exclude those citizenship issues, though, those by-elections, as it's only 1.4% there. Take out as well Aston. That's when we get a figure that we think both sides would be thinking is about par here. 2.7% swing against the government. Much more than that, Labor will be worried. Much less, Peter Dutton will have his concerns.
See what's going to be interesting? It is going to be really interesting Saturday night. Joining me now, former Liberal MP Nicole Flint. She knows marginal seats inside out. And Pauline Hanson's Chief of Staff, James Ashby. Well, welcome to you both. James, I'll start with you. You are also no slouch when it comes to campaigns. Dunkley. It's fascinating to me hearing Tom come off the top there saying, you know, the things that are going in the Liberal Party's favour in this seat, lots of tradies, lots of people with a mortgage. I mean, 20 or 30 years ago, that was Labor bread and butter, and this shows you how divorced they are from working Australians.
Yeah, you bet. And if this goes against the Labor Party, as I think it will this week, certainly we've only got 2 days to go. The campaigning is hot on the ground, as we've seen on news bulletins. But Anthony Albanese, by rights, will probably go to an early election. And I would suggest it's 2024 he'll do that, not wait until 2025, because there are plenty of other marginal seats in other very similar areas across this country, not just Victoria. These are middle-class people that have had a gutful of a Prime Minister who doesn't understand what middle class are going through. The Prime Minister has been absent from this country for far too long. He has lied to the people over tax cuts. And now we're only hearing today another charge on one of those 149 detainees that have been released for sexual assault has occurred. So all these things are going against the Labor Party. And of course, the announcement this morning that someone within, I suspect it's Labor, has been a spy caught out by ASIO, these are not going to play to the Prime Minister's favour.
I'll just mention too, those charges now, James, have been withdrawn by Victoria Police late this afternoon, but couldn't agree more with everything else you had to say. Nick, that's all right. No, Nick, you represented a marginal seat that's not dissimilar to the seat of Dunkley. I know you keep your hand in South Australian politics. Give me your sense of how the issues, I mean, the ute tax coming for tradies and others is a perfect example, the emission standard. Give me a sense how you think the issues will be playing out in a seat like Dunkley.
Well, I really have to agree with all of James's assessments, Peter. The tradie tax, the ute tax, which will hit grey nomads, families, farmers as well. It's cost of living. Like, cost of living is through the roof for anyone who's renting or has a mortgage, and that will be very decisive in Dunkley and other seats like Boothby, Western New South Wales, Western Sydney. All of our mortgage belt seats are really feeling it at the moment. They know they've been lied to by the Prime Minister on power prices. Power prices are hurting our small businesses as well, Peter. It's food, it's fuel, it's not even being able to buy a beer at the pub anymore because prices are going through the roof. So Dunkley is going to be a very important indicator of what is to come for both the Coalition and the Labor Party at the next federal election. I can't see Labor getting on top of any of these issues because they've had plenty of time and they haven't done it.
James, the PM's going out there sort of saying a 7% swing sort of the average. Well, no sophologist out there, Anthony Green or our wonderful Tom Connell, is saying it's anywhere near an average at 7%. I think the best average you can find there for the Prime Minister, taking out Aston, called that an outlier, taking out the citizenships is 2.7. I mean, I reckon 2.7 sort of on the cards come the weekend. But what about the preferencing by Labor of the Greens? Because all week in the Parliament, the PM's talked tough about the Greens. But this is what they do all the time, right? He wouldn't be in power if it wasn't for the Greens. They preference them at every election.
Well, they heavily relied on them in the last 2 terms of government, or the last 2 elections, to certainly get them across the line. And sure, they've got a slightly bigger margin this time than the previous election. But that's an election where One Nation and UAP were running. We've deliberately stayed out. UAP is no longer registered across the country federally, so they're not running. We've deliberately, as One Nation, stayed out of this by-election because if there is to be a litmus test as to who is better respected by the public here, there's 8% between One Nation and UAP that should, by rights, go to the coalition. And Peter Dutton is like an old Massey Ferguson tractor. He's reliable, he's trustworthy. That's why farmers keep him on the paddock. And I think that the Australian people would trust Peter Dutton over this current Prime Minister.
I made that point earlier in the week that it's a very different field of candidates than 2022. I will be looking for that vote out there on the centre-right too, James, come Saturday night. Hey, Nicole, the head of the Bureau of Meteorology, I mean, this is just audacious. He was out today blaming the media for catastrophising, he says, all this hot weather, for the media making a big song and dance about the El Nino or El Nina, whatever, which way it was, the summer that never really eventuated. But of course, you and I both know, we've got family that are farmers. The bomb was out there in spring last year saying it's going to be a horror summer, dry summer, no feed, issues with water and rainfall, get rid of your stock. A lot of farmers did. And of course, that weather didn't turn up.
Exactly, Peter. And I think I read something with the head of BOM trying to allege that farmers wouldn't make business decisions based on BOM's advice. Well, that is completely outrageous. If that is what he said to Parliament last night, that is completely outrageous because, of course, farmers make business decisions based on the advice of BOM. Who on earth else are they going to get their weather advice from? And it has cost Australian farmers millions, probably hundreds of millions of dollars, because they did destock, which flooded the market. It affected sheep and cattle. And that has a flow-on effect into every single community, let alone the federal budget bottom dollar that has, because we've seen stock prices crash, essentially. Now, they've come back, but last year was disastrous for livestock producers, and we have a wine glut, which is hugely concerning for our poor wine growers around the nation. Labor has got things into a terrible mess, and it's thanks to the likes of BOM. So they need to be held to account, and I don't see Labor doing that.
James, what's going on in Queensland, the fallout, I mean, regarding that decision in the Supreme Court that said COVID-19 vaccine mandates for frontline workers are illegal? This says to me compensation is going to be on the table, and all of those return to work orders or the stay away orders will be now reversed. I know in the case of Victoria, I was speaking to firefighters this week. I mean, they still can't work in Victoria unless they have 3 jabs. 55 of them around the country are stood down. Do we think we'll see compensation paid out of Queensland?
Yeah, and look, a lot of these people deserve it rightly. Some have lost homes. I know in my area of Keppel, where I'm running for the state, I've spoken to families there where one's a prison guard officer and the other's a school teacher, and both were threatened with their jobs. Both have certainly had professional misconduct threats against them in the police force as well. Look, it's one thing to say the state should be on the hook here, but I think a lot of these people, they're frontline service people who are supposed to be represented by unions. Part of me says the unions should be on the hook for compensation as well, because typically unions go out there and fight tooth and nail to the letter of the law, and in this case, they have overlooked the unlawful nature of these mandates that were implemented not just by the state government, but then also supported by the union. So the police union, you should hang your head in shame, Ian. I generally like you, but you got this wrong. The teachers' union, you got it wrong. The nurses' union, you got it wrong. And so too did so many other frontline workers who were relying, ambulance officers, those in the prison system. You pay good dues every single year. I think your unions at least owe you what you've paid them the last couple of years as a medium form of compensation. And yes, the state should be on the hook.
Nick, a quick one. I read a report today, 40 politicians federally, they own investment properties, but they haven't listed the rent they're getting from them, if they're getting rent, on the register. Now, I know they don't have to put the quantum of the rent, but if it's being rented out, I thought they had to, under the rules, say they're receiving rental income.
Well, Peter, if they're not following the rules, the department needs to hold them to account. We've got a lot of well-paid bureaucrats that are responsible for monitoring these sorts of things, and they need to enforce the rules. I mean, remember Section 44, we all got audited. It sounds like the department needs to do an audit and work out what's going on here.
Yeah, I want them to play by the rules. Absolutely. Thank you both, James Ashby, Nicole Flint. Great to have your company. Great to have your company too. It's been a wonderful week. I'll be back here on, I was going to say Monday, but I won't be back here on Monday. I'll be back here at 6 on Saturday night for the Dunkley by-election, and then again on Monday. I'll see you then.